Let's move on to some common autistic experiences. Again, this might be a review for some of you, but I think these are helpful, especially when you're interacting with students and others in your life. But some of the common experiences you will see is difficulty with making eye contact, difficulty understanding social cues, difficulty understanding facial expressions, body language, any of that nonverbal communication. Autistic individuals often have heightened sensory sensitivity, sound, touch, taste, sight, so they can be very easily overstimulated if they're in a high sensory environment. Folks like this often have very literal thinking or black and white thinking, thinking all or nothing. It can be a very logical type of thinking as well. They can also be extremely creative and resilient, and you often find a dislike of small talk. In fact, this is one of my filter questions, not a diagnostic question by any stretch of the imagination. But I always like to ask students who I suspect might be on the spectrum, what do you think of small talk? And most of them dislike it or don't even understand it at all or the purpose of it. And so I often go through an example of what the purpose is to help them understand what the purpose is. But even the students who get it, understand why it happens, they still generally don't like it. There's a strong sense of justice with people who are autistic, and sometimes a difficulty regulating emotions as well. Some other experiences in terms of behaviors. Autistic folks will often have a lot of repetitive and compulsive behaviors. You might see them doing stimming behaviors. If you don't know what stimming behaviors are, those are repetitive movements that are done to help the person relax. This is where fidget toys come in. In my office, you'll usually see a wide array of fidget toys available to students I meet with because they do help people relax. But stimming could also look like rocking back and forth, or hand waving, or shaking of a leg, or manipulating an object in their hand, like a fidget toy. And again, it's done to help the person relax, but it's also important to know that stimming and playing with fidget toys actually helps them to focus, because this can be a lot of problems when an autistic person is interacting with somebody who's neurotypical who doesn't know this, and maybe they're having a really intense conversation with their professor about how they're performing in their class. And the professor's noticing that they're doodling the whole time they're talking, or playing with the fidget toy in their hand the whole time they're talking. A neurotypical person might be offended by that and say, well, you're not really paying attention. You're giving me a split attention. It's really important to understand that for a lot of individuals, and research backed this up, that manipulation of having that thing in their hand or being able to doodle is actually helping them to focus more on the conversation. It's not what the neurotypical person might assume about that. So again, stimming behaviors are for relaxation, for focusing. Other experiences autistic folks might demonstrate are difficulties expressing emotions or even identifying their emotions, executive function difficulties, feeling overwhelmed and making more important decisions, a need for order and routine. Routines are really important for autistic individuals. They help them feel grounded and like the world is more predictable. Frequent masking is a common behavior, and we're going to talk about that in a whole separate section coming up, so we'll go a little more in depth in a few minutes here. And then oftentimes you'll notice that people who are autistic have a very set of special interests, we call them, like an area of focus that they're super passionate about, where they could talk to you for hours about cicadas or 1975 baseball or whatever it is that is really they're interested in. And so we call those their special interests. Okay, so now let's talk about some common co-occurring disorders that you might see with ASD. So actually the most probably common one, I didn't even list here because it's so common, is social anxiety. And it might not always rise to the level of disorder, but most autistic folks experience some level of social anxiety. And you can kind of understand why, because they're outnumbered in this world. It's a neurotypical world designed for neurotypical people. So all the social interactions are designed in that way. And those can seem very confusing, confounding, and mysterious to people who don't get this in an intuitive level. So social anxiety is almost always a component when you're working with the autistic individuals. Another very common component is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, like symptoms. Again, that doesn't always reach the level of a clinical diagnosis. Sometimes it does, but that's very common. You'll see in people who are autistic. Autistic folks can also experience higher rates of bipolar disorder, like I mentioned, anxiety disorders, ADHD, depression, learning difficulties, intellectual difficulties, even some medical disorders like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, epilepsy. I believe dysautonomia is now one that's being looked at as well. So this is obviously not an inclusive list, an all-inclusive list of co-occurring disorders, but with obsessive OCD and social anxiety probably being the two most common, and ADHD right there as well. So, okay, so let's talk about autism as a spectrum. So the spectrum way of describing it is not great. It can be improved upon, and I think we have done so. So most people think about like a spectrum, right? Like a continuum where somebody can be less autistic or more autistic. Or like I referenced earlier, we might even break it down into functioning levels, so level 1, level 2, level 3, as the DSM currently does. There can be some negative connotations to this, but it also doesn't really fully get at describing the true the breadth of what autism is and the different ways that it can impact an individual. So I would recommend, you'll see here, instead of thinking about it like a spectrum or a continuum, think about it like this circle plot here, right? This graph, where you have these different pies of the circle, and each of those represents a different area of functioning. And each person might have their dot closer to the inner of the circle where they're lower functioning, or they might be very high functioning in that particular area. And so if you think about it, you can have dots in all different arrangements on this circle, where you might have somebody who is autistic who might actually have really good motor skills and language skills, but really struggles with sensory perception or social functioning or executive functioning. So when you think about it like this, while there are a lot of commonalities and common symptoms that and experiences that autistic folks experience, right? This also means that autistic folks can look very different from one to the next. There's an old saying that where if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, right? Another way of visualizing this that can be helpful is think about a sound mixing board, right, that has all those different levels that you can put up. Picture one that has 100 different levels, and each of those levels represents a different potentially common experience that autistic individuals might encounter, right? Maybe social skills, psychomotor skills, things like that, nonverbal skills. So if any individual might have a completely different constellation and arrangement of where those levels are put on that. That's, I think, a more accurate way instead of the more simplistic just continuum, right? Because you can have somebody who's maybe more autistic in one way but not in another way, and how do you reconcile that? That's where the pie chart or the mixing board analogy, I think, is a better way of describing what we mean by autism as a spectrum. Most important thing to take away from this is that no autistic person is the same. And that it's always good to meet the person and the student where they're at, to get to know them and try and figure out what their experiences of autism are.